The grand marble columns of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia loomed large as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett climbed the steps, her navy blue suit crisp against the morning light. Camera flashes exploded around her. This wasn't just any hearing. This was the day everyone said would end her rising political career. Judge Richard Leon's courtroom was already packed to capacity, reporters and spectators squeezed shoulder to shoulder. The air crackled with tension as Crockett walked down the center aisle, her steps measured and confident despite what awaited her. At the prosecution table sat Thomas Harrington, the legendary federal prosecutor with 50 consecutive wins, his silver hair catching the light as he arranged his notes with military precision. "Order in the court!" The bailiff's voice cut through the whispers. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Richard Leon." The distinguished judge with 30 years on the bench entered, his piercing gaze sweeping the room before landing on Crockett. His reputation for tough questioning and zero tolerance for unprepared attorneys was legendary. Many expected him to demolish the freshman congresswoman who dared step into his courtroom. "Congresswoman Crockett," Judge Len's voice boomed across the silent room, "you're aware that your client faces serious charges that could impact national security. Are you certain you want to proceed as counsel rather than referring this to a more, experienced attorney?" The gallery hushed. Prosecutor Harrington smirked, leaning back in his chair as if victory was already certain. But what happened next left everyone stunned. Crockett stood, smoothed her jacket, and locked eyes with the intimidating judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and clear, "before this day ends, I will present evidence that will not only exonerate my client, but expose a deliberate attempt to undermine the very democratic principles this courtroom stands to protect. And with all due respect to your distinguished record, sir, you haven't seen anything yet." The gallery erupted in gasps. Judge Leon's eyebrows shot up, his gavel frozen mid-air. No one addressed him this way. The prosecutor's smirk vanished. In just 30 seconds, Jasmine Crockett had transformed from presumed victim to unexpected force. The battle was on. Before we dive deeper into this stunning courtroom showdown, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more explosive political stories that the mainstream media won't show you. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of Courtroom 18, casting dramatic shadows across Judge Richard Leon's bench. At 73, Leon had seen it all in his decades on the federal bench. Appointed by President George W. Bush in 2002, he'd presided over cases involving national security, major corporate mergers, and high-profile political scandals. His reputation for stern questioning and thorough analysis had earned him the nickname the Lion among the D.C. legal community. Today, his penetrating gaze studied the unexpected defense counsel standing before him. Jasmine Crockett was a freshman congresswoman from Texas, but before entering politics, she had built a reputation as a formidable civil rights attorney. At 42, she represented a new generation of black women in Congress, bold, unapologetic, and unwilling to back down from a fight. Her decision to personally represent community organizer Marcus Washington had shocked the political establishment. Washington, accused of illegally accessing classified government documents and sharing them with journalists, faced up to 20 years in prison under the Espionage Act. The prosecution calls Special Agent Robert Thompson, announced Thomas Harrington, the seasoned federal prosecutor handling the case. Harrington had been handpicked by the Attorney General himself, a signal of how seriously the government took this case. Tall, with a military bearing and carefully controlled gestures, Harrington had never lost an espionage case in his 27-year career. Thompson took the stand, a decorated FBI agent with 15 years of experience in counterintelligence. "Special Agent Thompson," Harrington began, his voice measured and authoritative, "please explain to the court how you discovered Mr. Washington's alleged activities. During routine monitoring of government systems, we detected unauthorized access to classified files concerning domestic surveillance programs. Our investigation traced this breach to an IP address associated with the defendant's home network. Subsequently, these exact documents appeared in a series of articles published by the Washington Chronicle, exposing what they called unconstitutional surveillance of community organizations." The gallery murmured as Thompson continued. "We executed a search warrant and found evidence on Mr. Washington's devices linking him to both the breach and direct communication with journalists. As a former government contractor with the Department of Homeland Security, he knew exactly what he was doing and the laws he was breaking. Marcus Washington sat motionless at the defense table. A 35-year-old former intelligence analyst turned community activist, he had dedicated the past 5 years to organizing against government overreach in Black and brown communities. His supporters called him a whistleblower, exposing illegal surveillance. The government called him a traitor who had compromised national security. Harrington turned to face the gallery, his voice rising for effect. This is not a case about politics or activism. This is about the deliberate theft of classified information that has damaged our intelligence capabilities and potentially endangered American lives. Mr. Washington is not a whistleblower. He's a criminal who violated his oath and the law. Judge Leon nodded slightly, making notes. The case seems straightforward, the evidence damning the defendant's guilt almost certain. Most observers expected a quick trial ending in conviction. At the defense table, Congresswoman Crockett remained calm, occasionally whispering to her client. As a former defense attorney who had handled high-stakes cases in Texas, she was no stranger to courtrooms, but this federal espionage case represented an entirely different level of challenge. Many questioned why she would risk her political career on such a controversial case. Conservative pundits had already labeled her the traitor's defender in evening news segments. Ms. Crockett, Judge Leon addressed her directly. Given the classified nature of much of the evidence, are you prepared to navigate the CIPA procedures? He referred to the Classified Information Procedures Act, a complex set of rules governing how classified information could be used in court. Absolutely, Your Honor, Crockett replied confidently. I've already obtained the necessary security clearances, and I'm fully prepared to handle all aspects of this case, including the classified materials. The judge studied her for a moment. Very well, but I warn you, this court will not tolerate any grandstanding or attempts to turn these proceedings into political theater. Crockett nodded respectfully. My only interest is justice, Your Honor, and by the end of this trial, I believe the court will see that justice and the truth are on our side. As the prosecution continued presenting its seemingly ironclad case, few in the courtroom believed her. The stakes couldn't be higher, not just for Marcus Washington, who faced decades in prison, but for the broader questions of government transparency, whistleblower protections, and the balance between national security and civil liberties. And for Jasmine Crockett herself, this case could either establish her as a principled defender of constitutional rights or destroy her promising political career. What no one in that courtroom yet realized was that Congresswoman Crockett had not come unprepared. Behind her composed exterior lay a strategy that would soon turn this seemingly open and shut case completely on its head. The trial's third day began with a palpable shift in atmosphere. The initial media frenzy had settled into focused attention as prosecution witness after witness had built what appeared to be an unassailable case against Marcus Washington. Special agents, cybersecurity experts, and government officials had testified to the gravity of the breach and the clear digital trail leading to Washington's devices. Judge Richard Leon maintained his reputation for tight control of his courtroom, occasionally interrupting with pointed questions that seemed to further strengthen the government's narrative. The prosecution's case was methodical, professional, and devastating. Several times, sympathetic observers had glanced at Congresswoman Crockett with something approaching pity. The prosecution calls Deputy Director Philip Mercer, announced Harrington, a note of finality in his voice. Mercer, the second-in-command at the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, was their star witness, the one who would tie everything together and cement Washington's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Mercer cut an imposing figure as he took the stand, tall, gray-haired, with the confidence of a man who had spent decades protecting America's secrets. After establishing his credentials, Harrington moved directly to the heart of the matter. Deputy Director Mercer, based on your review of all evidence in this case, can you state with certainty that the defendant, Marcus Washington, illegally accessed and leaked classified national security information? Yes, without question, Mercer replied firmly. The digital evidence is conclusive. The access logs, the file transfers, the communication records, they all point directly to Mr. Washington. At least was not accidental or incidental access. This was a deliberate breach of systems he no longer had authorization to enter, followed by the intentional disclosure of classified material to unauthorized persons. And, in your expert opinion, did this disclosure damage national security? Mercer leaned forward, his expression grave. Absolutely. These disclosures revealed sensitive intelligence gathering methods and compromised ongoing operations. The damage assessment is still underway, but we know for certain that our capabilities have been significantly impacted. Throughout this testimony, Crockett remained surprisingly calm, taking occasional notes but making no objections. Her restraint puzzled observers who expected a more aggressive defense. Washington sat beside her, his expression unreadable. "No further questions, Your Honor?" Harrington concluded, returning to his table with the satisfied air of someone who had just locked a door and thrown away the key. Judge Leon turned to the defense table. "Congresswoman Crockett, your witness." The courtroom fell silent as Jasmine Crockett rose, straightening her jacket before approaching the stand. Her heels clicked rhythmically on the polished floor, the sound emphasizing the tension in the room. "Deputy Director Mercer," she began pleasantly, "thank you for your service to our country. I just have a few questions to clarify some points." Her tone was respectful, almost deferential, nothing like the firebrand persona she exhibited in congressional hearings. "Of course, Congresswoman," Mercer replied, his posture relaxed. "You testified that Mr. Washington accessed systems he was not authorized to enter. Can you explain how he managed to do this, given the sophisticated security protocols in place?" Mercer shifted slightly. "We believe he retained credentials from his time as a contractor, which he then used illegally after his clearance was revoked." "I see." Crockett nodded thoughtfully. "And these credentials remained active for how long after his departure from government service?" "Approximately 14 months, Mercer admitted. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Crockett's expression didn't change. 14 months. So would it be fair to say there was a significant security lapse in not deactivating these credentials? Objection? Harrington was on his feet. Relevance? The government's security procedures are not on trial here. Your Honor, Crockett countered calmly. The prosecution's entire case rests on the claim that my client maliciously breached secure systems. The means of access is directly relevant. Judge Leon considered for a moment. Overruled, the witness will answer. Mercer cleared his throat. There was an administrative oversight, yes. Thank you. Crockett continued. Now, regarding the documents in question, you've testified they contained information about domestic surveillance programs. Were these programs targeting American citizens without warrants? Objection, Harrington nearly shouted. That information is classified. Your Honor, we are operating under SIPA guidelines and this courtroom has been secured for discussion of classified material, Crockett reminded the judge. The nature of the programs is central to my client's defense. Judge Leon's eyes narrowed. Mr. Harrington, the defense is correct. We're in a closed session precisely to allow discussion of classified information. Objection overruled. Mercer's composure cracked slightly. The programs operated within legal parameters established by the FISA court. That wasn't my question, Director, Crockett pressed. Were American citizens being surveilled without individual warrants, yes or no? The courtroom tensed as Mercer hesitated. Under certain broad authorizations, yes. A ripple of reaction moved through the gallery. Crockett nodded calmly, then walked to the defense table and picked up a document. I'd like to enter Defense Exhibit A into evidence, she said, handing copies to the clerk, judge, and prosecution. This is an internal audit from the Justice Department's Office of Professional Responsibility conducted 6 months before the alleged leak. As Harrington quickly scanned the document, his face darkened. He rose again. Your Honor, this document is highly classified. How did defense counsel obtain this? Before Judge Leon could respond, Crockett answered smoothly, through proper channels, Your Honor. As a member of the House Judiciary Committee, I requested and received clearance to review OPR audits related to surveillance programs. I've followed all SIPA procedures for its introduction in this case. The judge examined his copy, his expression inscrutable. The document appears to be properly declassified for purposes of this proceeding. I'll allow it. Crockett turned back to Mercer, who had grown visibly uncomfortable. Director Mercer, are you familiar with this audit? Have been briefed on it, yes. Then you're aware it concluded that certain surveillance programs were operating outside established legal frameworks and potentially in violation of Fourth Amendment protections. Isn't that correct? The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mercer's jaw tightened. That was one interpretation of certain findings, yes. And isn't it true that this audit recommended immediate discontinuation of these programs 3 months before any information was leaked to the press? There were recommendations made, yes. Recommendations that were ignored, Crockett stated flatly. Harrington jumped up again. Objection, counsel is testifying. Sustained, Judge Leon ruled. Congresswoman, please phrase that as a question. Crockett nodded apologetically. Director Mercer, were the audit's recommendations to discontinue these programs implemented prior to the leak? Mercer's discomfort was now plain for all to see. Not all recommendations had been implemented. No, these things take time. Thank you. Crockett cut him off, politely but firmly. She returned to the defense table and picked up another document. Defense Exhibit B, Your Honor. This is a memorandum from senior analyst Marcus Washington to his superiors, dated 2 months before his departure from government service. As the document was distributed, the gallery's murmurs grew louder. Judge Leon tapped his gavel once in warning. Director Mercer, in this memo, didn't Mr. Washington formally raise concerns about the legality of these surveillance programs through proper internal channels? Mercer glanced at Harrington, who sat rigid in his chair. Yes, he filed concerns. And what response did he receive? I'm not personally familiar with— Let me refresh your memory, Crockett interrupted, producing yet another document. Defense Exhibit C, the official response to Mr. Washington's concerns, signed by your office, informing him that his concerns were noted, but that he should continue operations as directed. Is that accurate? The courtroom was now completely silent, every person leaning forward slightly. Judge Leon himself had stopped writing and was watching the exchange with intense interest. That appears to be the response he received, yes, Mercer admitted reluctantly. Crockett walked slowly to stand directly in front of the witness stand. Director Mercer, isn't it true that after Mr. Washington left government service, he made multiple attempts to raise these concerns through official whistleblower channels at the Office of the Inspector General? I believe he made some inquiries, yes. Not just inquiries, Director. Defense Exhibit D, copies of 3 formal whistleblower complaints filed by Mr. Washington, none of which received any response. Are you aware of these? Mercer's face had grown pale. I was not directly involved in— And finally, Director Mercer, Crockett continued, her voice growing stronger, I'd like to address the most serious claim against my client, that his actions damaged national security. Defense Exhibit E is the complete damage assessment report commissioned after the leaks. Harrington was on his feet instantly. Your Honor, that report is top secret. It cannot possibly have been cleared for— It has been properly cleared for this proceeding, Mr. Harrington, Crockett interrupted calmly. You'll find the authorization on the cover page. Judge Leon examined the document carefully, then nodded. The document appears to be in order, Mr. Harrington. Crockett turned back to Mercer. Director, this report's conclusion states, and I quote, no operational assets were compromised. No surveillance targets were alerted. No ongoing investigations were impeded. In fact, the only damage identified was, quote, potential public relations and congressional oversight complications. Isn't that correct? The courtroom erupted in whispers. Marcus Washington, silent throughout the proceedings, straightened in his chair for the first time. The report speaks for itself, Mercer said stiffly. Yes, it does, Crockett agreed. One final question, Director. Terrible given that Mr. Washington attempted to raise his concerns through proper channels multiple times, that an internal audit had already identified these programs as potentially unconstitutional, and that no actual national security damage resulted from the disclosures, would you still characterize his actions as those of a traitor or those of a citizen attempting to expose government wrongdoing when all other avenues had failed? Objection! Harrington shouted. Calls for speculation and characterization. Sustained, Judge Leon ruled, but his eyes never left Mercer's face. Crockett nodded graciously. No further questions, Your Honor. As she returned to her seat, the mood in the courtroom had transformed completely. Judge Leon's expression had shifted from skepticism to intense focus. The gallery buzzed with shocked whispers. Several journalists had slipped out, presumably to phone in updates to their editors. But the most telling reaction came from Thomas Harrington. The prosecutor, who had begun the day with absolute confidence, now sat shuffling papers nervously, conferring urgently with his team. His case, seemingly unassailable just hours before, had begun to crumble under Congresswoman Crockett's methodical, evidence-based assault. And they were just getting started. As the lunch recess was called, Judge Richard Leon's gaze followed Jasmine Crockett out of the courtroom, his expression unreadable but his attention unmistakable. The battle had escalated beyond anyone's expectations, and the most explosive revelations were yet to come. The afternoon session began, with a courtroom atmosphere transformed from the morning's proceedings. Extra security had been posted at the doors as word spread about Congresswoman Crockett's devastating cross-examination. Legal observers who had dismissed her as a political dilettante now sat forward in their seats, waiting for what would come next. Judge Leon entered, his demeanor noticeably more attentive than the previous days. "Mr. Harrington," the judge addressed the prosecutor, "does the government wish to redirect with Deputy Director Mercer?" Harrington stood, his earlier confidence now tempered with caution. "No, Your Honor. The government rests its case." A subtle murmur ran through the gallery. The prosecution abandoning redirect examination of their star witness was unexpected, a tactical retreat that spoke volumes. "Very well," Judge Leon nodded. "Congresswoman Crockett, you may present the defense's case." Jasmine Crockett rose, buttoning her jacket as she approached the lectern. "Thank you, Your Honor. The defense calls Dr. Eleanor Winters." A distinguished woman in her 60s made her way to the witness stand. After being sworn in, Crockett established her credentials: former legal counsel to the National Security Agency, current professor of constitutional law at Georgetown, and author of definitive texts on surveillance law and whistleblower protections. "Dr. Winters," Crockett began, "based on your review of the declassified materials in this case, were the surveillance programs exposed by my client legal under the Constitution?" "No," Dr. Winters answered firmly. "They clearly violated Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure. The programs used extraordinarily broad parameters to monitor communications of American citizens without individual warrants or reasonable suspicion. In my expert opinion, they were flatly unconstitutional. And what about the proper channels for reporting such concerns? Mr. Washington has been characterized as reckless for not exhausting official remedies. Did he have viable alternatives?" Dr. Winters adjusted her glasses. "I've reviewed Mr. Washington's attempts to report through official channels. They were thorough, persistent, and by the book. The reality is that the system failed him at every turn. Intelligence community whistleblowers faced extraordinary obstacles, and Mr. Washington encountered all of them: stonewalling, intimidation, and ultimately retaliation." For the next hour, Crockett led Dr. Winters through a masterful examination that systematically dismantled the government's case. The expert testimony reinforced that Washington had tried everything possible before going to journalists, and that the programs themselves were likely unconstitutional. When Harrington rose for cross-examination, his approach was notably restrained. He focused narrowly on technical definitions rather than challenging the substance of her testimony, a sign that he was trying to limit damage rather than win points. After Dr. Winters stepped down, Crockett called her next witness. The defense calls James Morrison. A slender man in his 50s approached the stand. After establishing his credentials as a former oversight official at the Department of Justice, Crockett got straight to the point. "Mr. Morrison, in your role overseeing compliance, did you personally review the surveillance programs at issue in this case?" "I did," Morrison confirmed. "I was part of the audit team that produced the report defense counsel introduced earlier." "And what did you conclude?" Morrison leaned forward. "We found systematic violations of established guidelines. The programs had expanded far beyond their original authorization, with virtually no meaningful oversight. When we attempted to rein them in, we encountered resistance at every level." "Did you ever meet Marcus Washington during this process?" "Yes," Morrison nodded. "He was one of several analysts who raised concerns internally. He stood out because of his persistence and his detailed documentation of specific violations." "What happened to those who raised concerns?" Morrison's expression darkened. "Nothing good. Several were reassigned to dead-end positions. Performance evaluation suddenly turned negative. Some found themselves under investigation for unrelated matters. The message was clear: stay quiet or face consequences. Harrington's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective. Morrison remained unflappable, his testimony damaging not just to the case against Washington, but to the entire narrative the government had constructed. As the afternoon wore on, Crockett called two more witnesses: a constitutional scholar who testified about the public interest served by exposing illegal government activities, and a cybersecurity expert who challenged the prosecution's claims about how the information had been accessed. By 4 o'clock, the defense's case had shifted the entire framework of the trial. What had begun as a prosecution of a leaker had transformed into an examination of government overreach and failed accountability systems. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. "The defense calls Marcus Washington," Crockett announced. The defendant rose and moved to the witness stand. After being sworn in, he sat with perfect posture, his expression calm but determined. The gallery fell completely silent. "Mr. Washington," Crockett began gently, "please tell the court about your background and how you came to work in intelligence." Washington spoke clearly, describing his education, his military service, and his subsequent work as an intelligence analyst. He explained his initial pride in his work and his deep commitment to national security. "When did you first become concerned about the programs you eventually exposed?" "It was gradual," Washington explained. "At first I noticed the targeting parameters becoming broader, sweeping in more and more Americans with no connection to any threat. Then I saw how the data was being used, not just to identify security risks, but to map community organizations, track activists, and monitor religious groups with no evidence of wrongdoing." "What did you do when you recognized these issues?" "Exactly what I was supposed to do," he replied. "I raised concerns with my direct supervisors. When that went nowhere, I filed formal complaints through the chain of command. I documented everything meticulously. I believed in the system and thought surely someone would recognize the problem once it was properly reported." As Washington detailed his increasingly desperate attempts to work within the system, the ignored memos, the blocked Inspector General complaints, the subtle and then not-so-subtle warnings to drop the matter, the courtroom remained spellbound. His testimony was not that of a reckless ideologue, but of a conscientious professional who had tried every available remedy before going public. "Mr. Washington, did you want to leak classified information to the press?" Crockett asked. "No," he answered firmly. "It was the last thing I wanted to do. I believed in the mission. I understood the importance of secrecy in appropriate circumstances. But I also took an oath to the Constitution, not to any agency or program. When I exhausted every internal channel and the violations continued, I felt I had no choice but to inform the public." "Did you take any precautions to minimize potential harm?" "Absolutely. I never revealed sources, methods, or identities that could endanger operations or individuals. I focused exclusively on the unconstitutional domestic surveillance, and I worked with experienced journalists who consulted with the government before publication to ensure no genuine security information was compromised." When Harrington began his cross-examination, his strategy became clear: paint Washington as arrogant, as someone who appointed himself the arbiter of what should remain secret. "Mr. Washington," Harrington began sharply, "you took an oath to protect classified information, did you not?" "I did," Washington acknowledged. "I also took an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic." "And you decided you alone should determine what that meant? That your judgment superseded that of the courts, the Congress, and the entire intelligence community?" Washington remained calm. "No, sir. I tried to work through established channels precisely because I didn't want to make that determination alone. But when those channels failed, when the courts were misled, Congress was kept in the dark, and oversight mechanisms were circumvented, I had to follow my conscience." For nearly an hour, Harrington pressed hard, looking for contradictions or admissions that would restore the prosecution's narrative. But Washington remained composed, his answers thoughtful and consistent. Rather than appearing defensive, he came across as principled and reluctant, someone who had made a difficult choice after exhausting all alternatives. As Harrington's cross-examination wound down, Judge Leon, who had been watching intently, asked his own question, the first time he had directly questioned any witness. "Mr. Washington," the judge leaned forward. If you could go back, knowing what you know now about the consequences, would you make the same decision? The courtroom held its breath. Washington considered the question carefully. Your Honor, I've lost my career, I've been separated from my family, I face years in prison. I would give anything not to have been put in that position. He paused. But if I found myself again confronting systematic violations of Americans' constitutional rights with all internal remedies exhausted, yes, I would make the same choice. Judge Leon nodded slowly, making a note. Redirect, Congresswoman Crockett? The judge asked. Crockett approached the stand for her final questions. Just one question, Mr. Washington. What do you believe should happen when government officials discover their agency is violating the Constitution? Washington straightened. They should stop it immediately. If they don't, those who know have a duty to report it through proper channels. And if those channels fail, if the violation continues despite every attempt to address it internally, then I believe they have not just a right but a responsibility to inform the public, carefully and responsibly. Thank you, Mr. Washington, Crockett said quietly. No further questions. The witness is excused, Judge Leon announced. Does the defense rest? Not quite, Your Honor, Crockett replied. The defense has one final witness. The gallery stirred in surprise. Most legal observers had assumed Washington would be the defense's final witness. The defense calls Deputy Attorney General Lawrence Phillips, Crockett announced. A shock ran through the courtroom. Phillips was the third-ranking official at the Justice Department, directly overseeing the National Security Division that had brought the case. He had not been on any witness list. Harrington was immediately on his feet. Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. Deputy Attorney General Phillips has not been notified, he is not prepared to testify, and he has no direct knowledge relevant to— Actually, Mr. Harrington, Crockett interrupted calmly, Deputy Attorney General Phillips is present in the courthouse pursuant to a properly served subpoena. She held up a document. And as for relevant knowledge, I believe he has quite a lot to offer this court. Judge Leon studied the subpoena Crockett handed to the clerk. The subpoena appears to be in order, Mr. Harrington. Is the Deputy Attorney General in the building? A court officer approached the bench and conferred quietly with the judge. It seems he is, Judge Leon confirmed. The court will take a 15-minute recess while Deputy Attorney General Phillips is brought to the courtroom. The gallery erupted in excited whispers as the judge left the bench. Harrington huddled urgently with his team, several members rushing out, presumably to contact Justice Department leadership. Crockett returned to the defense table, where she conferred quietly with Washington. When court resumed, Deputy Attorney General Phillips entered, his expression a carefully controlled mask of professional composure. After being sworn in, he took the stand, eyes fixed on Crockett with barely concealed hostility. Deputy Attorney General Phillips, Crockett began pleasantly, thank you for complying with the subpoena. I'll be brief. I expect you to be, Phillips replied coldly. Crockett smiled slightly. Sir, in your role overseeing the National Security Division, you were ultimately responsible for approving this prosecution, were you not? I was briefed on the case, yes. Were you also briefed on the internal audit that found the surveillance programs exposed by Mr. Washington were potentially unconstitutional? Phillips hesitated. I was made aware of certain compliance concerns, yes. And were you informed of Mr. Washington's multiple attempts to report these issues through proper channels? I don't recall the specific details of his internal complaints. Crockett approached the witness stand and handed Phillips a document. This is a memo addressed directly to your office dated 3 months before any information became public, outlining in detail the constitutional violations in these programs and Mr. Washington's failed attempts to address them internally. It bears your signature acknowledging receipt. Do you recall this document now? Phillips examined the paper, his composure cracking slightly. I receive hundreds of memoranda. I can't be expected to recall. Let me refresh your memory further, Crockett continued, producing another document. This is an email from your office to the FBI Counterintelligence Division, sent 2 days after you received that memo. It instructs them to, quote, identify the source of these complaints and ensure they understand the consequences of further disruption, end quote. Did you authorize this communication? The courtroom was utterly silent now, every eye fixed on Phillips as he visibly struggled with his response. That appears to be a communication from my office, yes, he finally admitted. One more document, Deputy Attorney General, Crockett said, presenting a third paper. This is dated 1 week after the Washington Chronicle published its first article based on Mr. Washington's disclosures. It's an internal Justice Department analysis concluding that the exposed programs were, in fact, operating outside legal parameters and should be discontinued immediately. Were you aware of this assessment when you approved charging Mr. Washington under the Espionage Act? Phillips' face had gone pale. Congresswoman, these are complex legal issues with significant national security implications. It's a simple question, sir, Crockett pressed. Did you approve espionage charges against Mr. Washington, knowing that he had exposed unconstitutional programs, had tried repeatedly to report through proper channels, and had carefully limited his disclosures to prevent any genuine harm to national security? The tension in the courtroom was electric. Judge Leon leaned forward, his attention completely focused on the witness. Phillips glanced desperately toward Harrington, who appeared frozen in place. Deputy Attorney General, Judge Leon intervened, his voice stern. You are under oath. Please answer the question. Phillips swallowed hard. Yes, he finally admitted. I was aware of those assessments when I approved the charges. Crockett stepped back, letting the admission hang in the air for a long moment. No further questions, Your Honor, she said quietly. The defense rests. Harrington made no attempt to cross-examine. The damage was done. This court will recess until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for closing arguments, Judge Leon announced, his voice betraying unusual emotion. As he rose to leave the bench, his gaze lingered on Congresswoman Crockett with unmistakable respect. The courtroom exploded into activity the moment the judge departed. Journalists rushed for the exits, legal observers huddled in stunned discussion, and spectators buzzed with excitement. At the prosecution table, Harrington sat motionless, staring at his notes. Marcus Washington turned to Crockett, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you, he whispered, no matter what happens tomorrow. Thank you for telling the truth. Crockett squeezed his hand briefly. The truth isn't finished yet, she promised. As she gathered her materials, every eye in the courtroom followed her movements. In just 4 hours of devastating examination, Congressman Jasmine Crockett had transformed not just a trial, but the entire national conversation around whistleblowers, surveillance, and accountability. And tomorrow would bring the final act. The morning of closing arguments dawned with a scene unprecedented in the history of the E. Barrett Prettyman Federal Courthouse. By 5 a.m., the line to enter stretched for blocks, citizens and journalists camping overnight for a chance to witness the conclusion of what had become the most talked-about trial in the country. Network satellite trucks jammed the streets, their antennas reaching skyward like a forest of metal trees. Inside the courtroom, the gallery packed to capacity. Judge Richard Leon entered precisely at 9 a.m., his demeanor noticeably different from the trial's beginning. Where he had once viewed Congresswoman Crockett with skepticism, he now nodded to her with subtle respect as he took his seat. Mr. Harrington, the judge addressed the prosecutor, you may present your closing argument. Thomas Harrington rose slowly, the confident swagger of the trial's opening days entirely gone. The previous day's revelations had fundamentally undermined his case, leaving him to salvage what he could from the wreckage. Your Honor, he began, his voice steady but subdued, this case remains, at its core, about classified information being disclosed without authorization. Whatever Mr. Washington's motivations, however he characterizes his actions, the fact remains that he took an oath to protect government secrets, and he broke that oath. Harrington proceeded cautiously, acknowledging the procedural shortcomings in how Washington's internal complaints had been handled, but insisting that such failures did not justify taking classified information to the press. The rule of law depends on people following established procedures, even when those procedures are imperfect, he argued. If every individual decides for themselves which laws to follow based on their personal assessment of right and wrong, we invite chaos. Mr. Yekov, Washington had legal options he did not pursue. He could have approached members of Congress directly, he could have filed in federal court. Instead, he appointed himself the arbiter of what should remain secret. As Harrington concluded his 30-minute argument, the weakness of his position was evident in what he didn't say. Gone were the earlier characterizations of Washington as a traitor or claims of grave damage to national security. Instead, he retreated to technical violations and procedure, asking the judge to uphold the principle that classified information must remain protected, regardless of circumstances. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington," Judge Leon said when the prosecutor finished. "Congresswoman Crockett, your closing argument." Jasmine Crockett rose, straightening her jacket as she moved to stand before the judge. The courtroom fell completely silent. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and resonant, "this case was never about classified information. It was about accountability. It was about what happens when the government betrays its most sacred obligation, to uphold the Constitution it is sworn to defend." She moved away from the lectern, speaking without notes as she faced the judge directly. "The evidence has established 3 incontrovertible facts. First, the surveillance programs Mr. Washington exposed were unconstitutional, a reality the government's own internal assessments had already confirmed. Second, Mr. Washington exhausted every available internal channel before going public, facing stonewalling and retaliation at every turn. And third, when he finally did disclose this information, he did so carefully and responsibly, causing no damage to legitimate national security interests." Crockett paused, letting these points settle. "The prosecution has asked what would happen if everyone decided which laws to follow based on personal judgment, but that profoundly mischaracterizes what occurred here. Mr. Washington didn't choose which laws to follow, he chose which oath to prioritize when placed in an impossible position." She moved closer to the judge's bench, her passion evident but controlled. "Every government employee swears 2 oaths that sometimes come into conflict. They swear to protect classified information, yes, but first and foremost, they swear to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. When Mr. Washington discovered that his own agency was systematically violating the Fourth Amendment rights of American citizens, and when every internal remedy failed, he faced an impossible choice between these competing obligations." Crockett turned briefly toward the gallery, her gaze sweeping across the packed courtroom. "The prosecution would have us believe that the oath to secrecy always supersedes the oath to the Constitution. That position is not just legally incorrect, it's dangerous to the very foundation of our republic. If government officials can violate the Constitution and then classify those violations to prevent disclosure, using the Espionage Act to punish those who expose such wrongdoing, then we have abandoned the rule of law in favor of rule by secrecy." She returned her attention to the judge. "Your Honor, the true measure of patriotism is not blind obedience to authority. It is fidelity to the principles upon which this nation was founded. When Marcus Washington exposed unconstitutional surveillance after exhausting all internal remedies, he wasn't betraying his country, he was serving it in the highest tradition of civic duty." Crockett walked to the defense table and placed her hand briefly on Washington's shoulder. The founders enshrined a free press in the First Amendment precisely because they understood that government power, unchecked by public scrutiny, inevitably tends toward abuse. They gave us a system of checks and balances because they knew that accountability requires transparency. When those systems fail, when oversight is circumvented, when the Constitution itself is violated in secret, it falls to citizens of conscience to restore the balance. She returned to stand before the judge for her conclusion. "This case will set a precedent far beyond one man's fate. It will signal whether we remain a nation governed by constitutional principles, or whether we have become a state where secrecy shields illegality and punishes those who dare to expose it. The choice before this court is not just whether to convict or acquit Marcus Washington. It is whether to affirm or abandon the proposition that no government agency, no matter how powerful, stands above the Constitution." Crockett's final words rang through the silent courtroom. "Your Honor, the defense does not merely ask for acquittal. We ask for vindication, not just for Marcus Washington, but for the principle that loyalty to the Constitution must always prevail over loyalty to any agency or program that violates it. The true threat to our nation comes not from those who expose unconstitutional actions, but from those who undertake them. We ask this court to reaffirm that in America, the Constitution remains our highest law, and those who defend it, even at great personal cost, deserve our gratitude, not our condemnation." She returned to her seat beside Washington, the courtroom utterly silent in the wake of her words. Judge Leon sat motionless for several moments, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he spoke. "This court will recess to consider its verdict. We will reconvene at 2 p.m. As the judge left the bench, the spell broke, and the courtroom erupted in conversation. Legal analysts who had initially dismissed Crockett now praised her closing as masterful and historic. Reporters rushed to file updates, predicting the direction of the verdict based on the judge's reactions throughout the trial. Outside the courthouse, the scene had transformed into something between a protest and a celebration. Crowds waved signs supporting Washington and whistleblower protections. Civil liberties organizations held impromptu press conferences on the courthouse steps, praising Crockett's defense as a watershed moment for accountability. At precisely 2 p.m., Judge Richard Leon returned to the bench. The courtroom fell instantly silent. "This court has carefully considered all evidence and arguments presented in this case," he began, his voice measured. "Before rendering a verdict, I wish to make several observations for the record." He removed his glasses, addressing the courtroom directly. The Espionage Act was enacted in 1917 primarily to combat actual spying during World War I. Its use against whistleblowers who expose potential government wrongdoing raises profound constitutional questions that courts have struggled to resolve. This case brings those questions into sharp focus. Judge Leon put his glasses back on, consulting his notes. "The evidence presented establishes that Mr. Washington discovered surveillance programs operating outside constitutional boundaries, that he repeatedly attempted to address these concerns through authorized channels, and that he disclosed information to journalists only after those efforts failed. Furthermore, he took significant precautions to minimize any potential harm to legitimate national security interests." The judge looked directly at the prosecution table. "Perhaps most troubling is the evidence that senior Justice Department officials were aware of the constitutional deficiencies in these programs and of Mr. Washington's attempts to report through proper channels, yet proceeded with espionage charges nonetheless. This suggests a prosecution motivated not by genuine national security concerns, but by a desire to silence criticism and avoid accountability." Harrington stared down at his hands, unable to meet the judge's gaze. "In a constitutional democracy, secrecy can be justified only as a necessary exception to the general rule of transparency, and only to the extent required to protect legitimate security interests. It cannot be used as a shield to conceal government actions that violate the very Constitution officials are sworn to uphold." Judge Leon turned his attention to Marcus Washington. "Mr. Washington, please rise." Washington stood, his expression calm but intense. "This court finds that your disclosures were made only after exhausting all reasonable internal remedies, were limited to information necessary to expose unconstitutional activities, and were undertaken with careful attention to minimizing any collateral impact on legitimate security concerns. These factors, combined with the compelling public interest in exposing violations of constitutional rights, lead me to conclude that your actions, while technically in violation of secrecy agreements, were justified under the extraordinary circumstances presented." The judge's voice grew stronger, filling the courtroom. "Therefore, on all accounts of the indictment, this court finds you not guilty." The gallery erupted in gasps and cheers. Washington remained standing, tears streaming down his face as Crockett embraced him. Judge Leon rapped his gavel for order. "This court is not done," he announced firmly. When quiet was restored, he continued, "The evidence presented in this trial raises serious questions about the constitutionality of certain surveillance programs and about the integrity of the Justice Department's decision to prosecute Mr. Washington. Accordingly, I am taking the extraordinary step of referring this matter to the Office of Professional Responsibility for a full investigation into possible misconduct by officials involved in both the surveillance programs and the decision to bring these charges." Harrington's head snapped up in shock. Such a referral from a federal judge was exceptionally rare and potentially career-ending for those implicated. "Additionally," Judge Leon continued, "I am ordering the unsealing of all court records in this case not directly impacting genuine national security, so that Congress and the public can have a full accounting of these matters." The judge leaned forward, his final words directed as much to the watching nation as to those in his courtroom. "The strength of our democracy depends not on our ability to keep secrets, but on our commitment to constitutional principles, even when they prove inconvenient. When the government operates within the shadows, beyond the reach of oversight and accountability, it is often citizens like Mr. Washington who restore the balance our founders intended." While this court does not encourage the unauthorized disclosure of classified information, neither can it countenance the prosecution of those who expose unconstitutional actions after exhausting all other remedies. With that, Judge Leon struck his gavel a final time. This court is adjourned. The aftermath was immediate and far-reaching. Within hours, news of the verdict dominated every major network and online platform. Crockett triumph and whistleblower vindication trended nationwide. Legal analysts called the decision landmarked and precedent-setting for future whistleblower cases. On the courthouse steps, surrounded by a sea of reporters, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood beside Marcus Washington for a brief statement. Today, justice prevailed, not just for one man, but for the Constitution itself, she declared, her voice carrying across the crowd. This verdict affirms that in America, our highest loyalty is not to any agency, program, or official, but to the principles of liberty and justice enshrined in our founding document. Mr. Washington's courage in exposing unconstitutional surveillance when all other channels failed represents the highest form of patriotism. Washington himself spoke only briefly. "I never wanted to be in this position," he said quietly. "I only wanted to honor my oath to the Constitution. I'm grateful to Congresswoman Crockett and to Judge Leon for ensuring that oath still means something." The political ramifications unfolded swiftly. By evening, congressional leaders from both parties were calling for hearings into the surveillance programs exposed during the trial. The White House announced a comprehensive review of intelligence oversight mechanisms and whistleblower protections. Civil liberties organizations reported record donations as public attention focused on constitutional rights in the digital age. For Jasmine Crockett, the trial transformed her from a freshman congresswoman into a national figure overnight. Legal experts who had initially questioned her decision to personally represent Washington now praised her strategic brilliance and constitutional expertise. Political commentators who had predicted the case would end her career now speculated about her future on the national stage. 3 days after the verdict, Crockett appeared on a major Sunday morning political show, where the host asked if she had anticipated the outcome. "I never doubted the strength of our case," she replied. "When you align yourself with the Constitution, you stand on the strongest possible ground." What surprised me was Judge Leon's courage in following the evidence wherever it led, regardless of political pressure. "And what about your political future?" the host pressed. "There's already talk of higher office." Crockett smiled. "My focus remains on serving my constituents and defending the Constitution. This case was never about my career. It was about ensuring that no American has to choose between their oath to the Constitution and their professional standing. That fight continues, and I'll be wherever I can be most effective in waging it." The most lasting impact, however, emerged in the weeks following the trial, as Judge Leon's order to unseal records revealed the full extent of the surveillance programs and the attempts to silence Washington. Congress passed the Constitutional Whistleblower Protection Act, establishing clearer channels for reporting government wrongdoing and stronger shields against retaliation. Intelligence agencies implemented new oversight mechanisms requiring constitutional review of surveillance programs. 6 months later, Marcus Washington received the Constitutional Courage Award from a bipartisan congressional committee, with Judge Richard Leon in attendance. In his introduction, the committee chairman cited Jasmine Crockett's closing argument: "The true measure of patriotism is not blind obedience to authority, but fidelity to the principles upon which this nation was founded." And as for Judge Leon, the jurist who had entered the trial skeptical of Crockett and her client, concluded his distinguished career with what many considered his finest hour. In his final interview before retirement, he was asked about the Washington case. In 30 years on the bench, he reflected, "I've never witnessed a more powerful defense or a more important constitutional moment." Congresswoman Crockett reminded us all that the law at its best is not about technical violations, but about fundamental principles. Her advocacy changed not just one case, but potentially the course of how we balance security and liberty for generations to come. The trial of Marcus Washington became required study in law schools nationwide, with Jasmine Crockett's defense cited as a model of constitutional advocacy. But perhaps the most significant legacy was invisible. The countless government officials who, inspired by the outcome, found the courage to report wrongdoing through newly strengthened channels, secure in the knowledge that the Constitution they swore to defend would defend them in return. As for the courtroom where it all unfolded, visitors still come just to sit in the gallery, trying to absorb something of the moment when a freshman congresswoman stood before a skeptical judge and transformed a prosecution into a triumph for constitutional principles. The words that froze the audience that day continue to echo. In America, the Constitution remains our highest law, and those who defend it, even at great personal cost, deserve our gratitude, not our condemnation. If you found this incredible story of justice and constitutional courage inspiring, don't forget to like and subscribe. We bring you the most important political and legal dramas that the mainstream media either misses or misrepresents. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our updates on Congresswoman Crockett's ongoing fight for accountability and the continuing fallout from this landmark case. Your support helps us keep bringing these crucial stories to light.